How long was Jesus on the cross, and why does that detail matter so much? At first glance, the answer seems simple, about 6 hours. Yet the deeper question is far more unsettling. Why only 6 hours, when crucifixion was designed to prolong suffering for days? This tension immediately shifts our focus. The issue is not merely about duration, but about meaning. Those 6 hours are not an incidental detail in history. They form a compressed, intentional window in which something profound unfolds, physically, psychologically, and spiritually. To understand the weight of those 6 hours, we must first step into the historical reality of crucifixion under the Roman Empire. Crucifixion was not simply a method of execution, it was a calculated instrument of terror. It was reserved for the lowest classes, slaves, rebels, and dangerous criminals, those considered threats to the social and political order. The goal was not efficiency, but spectacle. Victims were displayed publicly, often along roadsides, stripped of dignity and left to suffer in full view of passers-by. The process itself was deliberately prolonged. Death did not come quickly. Instead, it unfolded over many hours, sometimes stretching into 1, 2, or even 3 days. The mechanics of crucifixion explain why it lasted so long. Victims were not killed by the nails themselves, nor primarily by blood loss. Rather, death came through a slow process of exhaustion and asphyxiation. Suspended by their arms, the body's weight pressed down on the chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe. To inhale, the victim had to push up against the nails driven through their hands and feet, an act that caused excruciating pain. Each breath became a conscious, agonizing effort. Over time, as strength faded, the body could no longer lift itself, and suffocation gradually set in. This is why crucifixion could extend over days. The body resisted death, even as it endured relentless suffering. Against this backdrop, the case of Jesus stands out as deeply unusual. According to the Gospel accounts, he was on the cross from approximately 9 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, around 6 hours in total. Compared to the typical duration of crucifixion, this is strikingly brief. It immediately raises a critical question. Why did his death occur so much sooner? One possible explanation lies in the severe physical trauma he endured before even reaching the cross. He was scourged, a brutal form of whipping that could leave the victim in a state of shock. He was crowned with thorns, beaten, and forced to carry the instrument of his execution. By the time he was crucified, his body was already weakened to an extreme degree. From a medical perspective, this pre-existing condition could have accelerated the process of death. A body already pushed to its limits would have less capacity to endure the prolonged strain of crucifixion. However, if we stop at this explanation, we miss something essential. The Gospel narratives suggest that his death was not merely the result of physical collapse. They emphasize moments of awareness, intention, and control, even in the midst of suffering. One detail stands out in particular. At the moment of death, he cries out and gives up his spirit. This language is significant. It does not describe a passive slipping into death, but an active, deliberate act. It introduces a dimension that goes beyond physiology. This is where the 6-hour duration begins to take on a different meaning. It is not simply that his life ended more quickly than others. It is that the timing itself appears purposeful. Rather than being entirely dictated by the mechanics of crucifixion, his death unfolds within a defined window that allows for specific events, words, and interactions to occur. Each moment within those 6 hours carries weight, contributing to a larger narrative arc. The brevity of the time, paradoxically, intensifies its significance. In typical crucifixions, the extended duration emphasized the cruelty of the punishment. Here, the shorter time frame compresses the experience, creating a sense of concentration rather than dilution. Every hour matters. Every word spoken from the cross is remembered. Every interaction becomes part of a deliberate sequence. The question shifts from "why so short?" to what was accomplished within that time? This reframing challenges a purely historical or medical reading of the event. While those perspectives are important, they do not fully account for the structure and intentionality embedded in the narrative. The 6 hours are presented not as an accident of circumstance, but as a meaningful interval, one that allows for the completion of a mission. In this light, the anomaly of the 6-hour crucifixion becomes the very key to understanding it. If crucifixion typically lasted days, then a 6-hour duration demands explanation. It invites us to look beyond the surface and consider the possibility that what occurred was not governed solely by external forces, but also by an internal purpose. The suffering remains real, the physical mechanisms unchanged, but the framework in which they unfold is transformed. Ultimately, the question we began with, how long Jesus was on the cross, leads us into a deeper inquiry. The 6 hours are not just a measurement of time, they are a structured passage in which meaning is revealed. The historical context shows us what normally happened. The deviation from that norm forces us to ask why this case was different. And in that difference, we begin to see that the significance of those 6 hours lies not in their length, but in what they were meant to accomplish. If the historical context explains why crucifixion was so prolonged and brutal, the medical perspective allows us to enter the mechanism of that suffering with unsettling clarity. What actually caused death on the cross? Contrary to common assumptions, it was not a single factor, but a convergence of physiological breakdowns, each reinforcing the other in a slow, irreversible cascade. One of the primary mechanisms was asphyxiation, a gradual inability to breathe. When a body is suspended on a cross, the arms are extended and elevated, placing the chest cavity in a stretched position. This posture severely restricts the ability of the diaphragm to contract and expand normally. In simple terms, the lungs cannot fully inflate. Air can be drawn in partially, but exhaling becomes increasingly difficult. Carbon dioxide begins to accumulate in the bloodstream, creating a state of respiratory acidosis. The body instinctively tries to correct this imbalance, triggering an urgent need to breathe more deeply, but the position of the body makes that nearly impossible. To compensate, the victim must push upward, using the legs and arms to lift the body and relieve pressure on the chest. This action allows a fuller breath, but it comes at a terrible cost. The nails driven through the hands, or wrists, and feet become points of intense leverage. Every upward movement drives pain through already damaged nerves and tissues. Then, as exhaustion sets in, the body collapses back down, returning to the suffocating position. This cycle repeats endlessly. Push up to breathe, collapse in pain, struggle again. Breathing is no longer automatic. It becomes a conscious, agonizing decision. Alongside asphyxiation, blood loss plays a critical role. Prior to crucifixion, severe scourging could strip away layers of skin and expose underlying tissue, leading to significant hemorrhaging. While the nails themselves do not typically sever major arteries, they contribute to ongoing bleeding and trauma. Combined with dehydration, often exacerbated by exposure to the sun and the absence of fluids, the circulatory system begins to fail. Blood volume decreases, making it harder for the heart to maintain adequate pressure. This leads directly into the third major factor, shock. Specifically, hypovolemic shock due to blood loss and traumatic shock due to extreme pain and stress. As shock progresses, the heart rate increases in an attempt to compensate, but blood pressure drops. Organs receive less oxygen, and metabolic processes begin to break down. The body enters a state of systemic collapse. Muscles weaken, coordination fails, and the capacity to push upward for breath diminishes. What makes crucifixion uniquely horrifying is not just the presence of these factors, but the way they interact in a feedback loop. Asphyxiation forces the victim to move. Movement intensifies pain and accelerates exhaustion. Exhaustion reduces the ability to breathe. Reduced breathing worsens asphyxiation. At the same time, blood loss and shock steadily drain the body's remaining strength. There is no single normative moment, no clean transition from life to death. Instead, death emerges gradually through repetition. Each breath is harder than the last. Each attempt to survive deepens the very conditions that lead to death. From a strictly medical standpoint, we can draw a clear conclusion. Death by crucifixion is slow, cumulative, and cyclical. It is not a sudden event, but a process, a prolonged negotiation between the body's will to survive and its diminishing capacity to do so. The victim does not simply die. He endures a sequence of escalating failures, each one compounding the previous. In this sense, the suffering is not linear, but recursive. Pain is not experienced once, but relived in every breath. Yet this is precisely where the analysis cannot remain purely medical. Because when we return to the specific case we are examining, something does not fully align with what we would expect. If crucifixion typically unfolds over days, and if the body naturally resists death through these repeated cycles, then a 6-hour duration still stands out, not only historically, but physiologically. The body, even under extreme stress, is capable of prolonging this process. So why does it end when it does? This question opens the door to a theological dimension that reframes everything we have just examined. The Gospel accounts do not present the death as the inevitable endpoint of physical breakdown alone. Instead, they emphasize a moment of clarity and intention. At the culmination of the 6 hours, there is a final act described not as collapse, but as surrender. He gives up his spirit. This phrasing is crucial. It suggests agency. In most cases of crucifixion, death overtakes the victim when the body can no longer sustain the effort to breathe. It is involuntary, the result of total exhaustion. But here, the narrative introduces a different dynamic. The timing of death appears to coincide not merely with physical limits, but with a conscious act. The distinction is subtle but profound. Death is not only something that happens, it is something that is, in a sense, chosen. This does not negate the medical reality. The pain, the asphyxiation, the shock, all of it remains fully present. The body still undergoes the same brutal process. But layered onto that process is a dimension of meaning that cannot be reduced to physiology. The suffering is not random, it is directed. The duration is not arbitrary, it is sufficient. From a theological perspective, this transforms the interpretation of the entire event. The 6 hours are no longer seen as a truncated version of a typical crucifixion, but as a complete one. Complete not in terms of maximum duration, but in terms of fulfilled purpose. Every phase of suffering, every spoken word, every interaction within that time frame contributes to a larger objective. The endpoint is not determined solely by the body's failure, but by the completion of that objective. This is why the final declaration, often translated as "it is finished," carries such weight. It does not signify defeat or resignation. It marks the completion of a task. When viewed alongside the act of giving up the spirit, it reinforces the idea that the moment of death is aligned with the fulfillment of a mission. The timing is not incidental. It is integrated into the meaning of the event itself. In this light, the medical and theological dimensions do not contradict each other, they intersect. The medical analysis reveals the depth of physical suffering and the mechanisms that sustain it. The theological perspective reveals why that suffering unfolds within a specific frame and concludes at a specific moment. One explains the how, the other addresses the why. And it is precisely at this intersection that the significance of the 6 hours becomes most evident. The body endures a process that could extend far longer, yet the narrative brings it to a close at a point that allows for the completion of something beyond mere survival or endurance. The death is real, the suffering undeniable, but the conclusion is not simply the result of collapse. It is the culmination of a deliberate, purposeful passage through suffering toward completion. If the medical and theological dimensions explain how and why the crucifixion unfolds within a defined span, the 6-hour period itself reveals what actually happens within that time. It is not an empty duration filled only with silent suffering. It is structured, almost deliberately segmented, into moments that carry distinct emotional and symbolic weight. Each phase contributes to a progression, from external violence to internal crisis, and finally to completion. The first phase begins around the 3rd hour, approximately 9 o'clock in the morning. This is the moment of crucifixion itself, the physical act of being nailed to the cross. The violence here is direct, visible, and unmistakable. Iron pierces flesh, the body is lifted, and the process of suffering begins in its most tangible form. Yet what surrounds this moment intensifies it even further. The victim is not left in silence. He is exposed to the voices of those around him, soldiers mocking, religious leaders challenging, passers-by ridiculing. The atmosphere is not merely one of execution, but of humiliation. The crowd does not witness with neutrality, it participates. And it is precisely within this environment that one of the most paradoxical responses emerges. Instead of anger, retaliation, or even silence, a statement is spoken, a plea for forgiveness. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." This is not a response that comes after the pain has subsided or justice has been restored. It occurs at the very onset of suffering, when the wounds are fresh and the humiliation is at its peak. This introduces the first central theme of the 6-hour progression: forgiveness in the midst of pain. It challenges a deeply ingrained human instinct. Forgiveness is often imagined as something that follows resolution, a later stage when emotions have settled and clarity has returned. Here, however, forgiveness is immediate. It does not depend on apology, recognition, or change from those causing the harm. It is extended unconditionally, even as the harm continues. From a psychological standpoint, this is profoundly disruptive. Pain typically narrows perception, drawing attention inward towards self-preservation. Yet this moment reflects an outward orientation, a concern not for self, but for others, even those responsible for the suffering. It reframes the beginning of the crucifixion, not merely as an act of violence, but as the opening of a process in which meaning begins to emerge through response, not circumstance. As time progresses toward the 6th hour, around midday, a noticeable shift occurs. The narrative describes a darkness covering the land. Whether interpreted literally, symbolically, or both, the effect is clear. The external environment changes in a way that mirrors an internal transition. The earlier noise, the mockery, the movement, the visible activity, gives way to something heavier, more subdued. The atmosphere becomes dense, almost oppressive. This marks the second phase, crisis and inner darkness. If the first stage is defined by external suffering and a surprising response of forgiveness, the second stage moves inward. The darkness functions as more than a backdrop. It becomes a representation of a deeper struggle. The suffering is no longer only physical or social. It takes on an existential dimension. In human experience, moments of crisis often carry this same quality. There are times when clarity disappears, when familiar structures of meaning seem to collapse, and when the world itself feels altered. The midday darkness captures this sensation. It suggests a passage through a kind of internal night, where understanding is obscured and the weight of what is happening becomes more difficult to articulate. Importantly, this stage does not resolve immediately. It lingers, creating a space in which tension builds. The earlier act of forgiveness does not eliminate the depth of what follows. Instead, it coexists with it. This progression prevents the narrative from becoming simplistic. It acknowledges that even with purpose and intention, the experience of suffering can move through phases of disorientation and heaviness, By the 9th hour, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the progression reaches its peak. Two statements emerge that define this final stage. The first is a cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The second follows later, "It is finished." Together, they encapsulate the third phase, isolation and completion. The cry of abandonment is one of the most striking elements in the entire sequence. It expresses a sense of separation at the deepest possible level, not just from people, but from the very source of meaning and connection. This is not merely physical pain or social rejection, it is existential loneliness. It resonates with a universal human fear, the feeling of being utterly alone even when presence is most needed. What makes this moment significant is its honesty. It does not suppress or bypass the experience of abandonment. Instead, it gives it voice. In doing so, it bridges the gap between the narrative and human experience. The suffering is no longer distant or abstract. It becomes recognizable, even relatable. It acknowledges that even within a purposeful journey, there can be moments where that purpose feels obscured. And yet, this is not the final word. The declaration that follows, "It is finished," transforms the meaning of everything that precedes it. The sense of abandonment does not lead to despair as an endpoint. Instead, it becomes part of a trajectory that leads to completion. The two statements, taken together, reveal a movement, from questioning to resolution, from fragmentation to fulfillment. This final phase completes the arc of the 6 hours. What began with physical violence and an unexpected act of forgiveness moves through a period of darkness and crisis and culminates in a moment that integrates suffering into a completed purpose. The structure is not random, it is progressive. Each stage builds upon the previous one, leading toward a defined conclusion. However, to fully grasp the depth of this progression, it is necessary to look beyond the visible events and consider the psychological dimension that underlies them. Because the pain experienced during these 6 hours is not limited to the body, it extends into the realm of relationships, trust, and identity. One of the earliest and most significant elements in this dimension is betrayal. A close disciple, someone who shared time, trust, and proximity, becomes the agent through which the arrest is initiated. Betrayal carries a unique psychological weight because it disrupts expectation. Harm from an enemy can be anticipated. Harm from a trusted figure fractures something deeper. It introduces a rupture not only in relationship, but in the perception of security itself. Closely related to this is denial. Another disciple who had previously expressed unwavering loyalty distances himself under pressure. This does not occur under extreme torture or coercion, but in the presence of social tension and fear. The denial reflects a common human pattern. When confronted with risk, commitment can falter. The result is not only abandonment, but a form of silent disassociation. Finally, there is the role of the crowd. Public opinion shifts dramatically from earlier admiration to open mockery. This transformation amplifies the sense of isolation. It is one thing to be rejected by individuals, it is another to be surrounded by collective hostility. The crowd creates an environment in which there is no refuge, no counterbalance of support. When these elements are considered together, betrayal, denial, and public rejection, they form a comprehensive psychological landscape. The suffering is no longer confined to physical mechanisms or theological purpose. It becomes relational and emotional. It engages the core aspects of human experience: trust, belonging, and identity. This leads to a critical conclusion. The psychological pain may surpass the physical pain in depth and endurance. Physical suffering, while intense, operates within the limits of the body. Psychological suffering, however, extends into memory, meaning, and perception. It affects not only what is felt, but how reality itself is interpreted. In the context of the 6-hour progression, This dimension deepens the significance of each stage. Forgiveness becomes more striking when viewed against betrayal. The darkness becomes heavier when understood as more than environmental. The cry of abandonment becomes more profound when seen as the culmination of relational rupture. And the final declaration of completion gains its full weight when it encompasses not only physical endurance, but the navigation of profound emotional and psychological isolation. What emerges then is not simply a sequence of events, but a layered experience in which physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions converge. The 6 hours are not empty or uniform, they are structured, intense, and comprehensive. They move from action to reflection, from external to internal, and from fragmentation to fulfillment, revealing that the depth of suffering is matched only by the depth of meaning carried within it. By the time we reach this stage of the analysis, a question becomes unavoidable, one that arises naturally from everything that has been observed so far. If the physical suffering was as severe as described, if the body had already been pushed to extreme limits before the crucifixion even began, then why did death not come sooner? From a purely physiological standpoint, an earlier death would not only have been possible, it would have been entirely expected. The conditions leading up to the crucifixion were already sufficient to cause collapse. Severe scourging alone could induce hypovolemic shock. Blood loss, dehydration, and trauma would have weakened the body to the point where sustaining prolonged suffering would be difficult. In many documented cases, individuals subjected to such pre-crucifixion treatment could lose consciousness or die before the full process even unfolded. When combined with the mechanics of crucifixion, restricted breathing, intense pain, and progressive exhaustion, the expectation would be a relatively rapid decline, potentially ending sooner than 6 hours. And yet, the actual duration remains consistent, approximately 6 hours, not shorter. This is where the tension deepens. The body, by all measurable indicators, was capable of failing earlier, but it did not. Instead, the process continues long enough to encompass a sequence of events that, taken together, form a coherent pattern. This is not merely a continuation of suffering, it is a continuation with structure. The key to understanding this lies not in denying the physical possibility of an earlier death, but in recognizing that the timing appears to serve a purpose. The 6-hour duration is not excessive when compared to typical crucifixions, but it is sufficient. It provides enough space for specific actions, statements, and interactions to occur, elements that would not exist if the process had been abruptly shortened. Consider what unfolds within that time frame. At the very beginning, forgiveness is extended, not as a reaction after the fact, but as an initiating act. This establishes a foundation that shapes the interpretation of everything that follows. Without the time for this moment to be expressed, the narrative would lose a central dimension, the idea that suffering does not automatically produce bitterness, but can instead generate mercy. As the hours progress, another critical interaction takes place, the exchange with the individual crucified alongside him. In the midst of shared suffering, a recognition occurs, followed by a promise. This moment introduces the theme of personal redemption, not in an abstract sense, but in a direct, immediate context. It suggests that even within the final stages of life, transformation remains possible. If the duration had been shorter, this interaction might never have occurred. The absence of time would mean the absence of this dimension of the narrative. There is also the establishment of relational continuity. In a moment that might otherwise be overlooked, a new connection is formed, one that extends beyond the immediate situation. It reflects a concern not only for the present, but for what continues afterward. This indicates that the process unfolding on the cross is not isolated in time. It has implications that move forward, shaping what comes next. When these elements are viewed together, forgiveness, redemption, relational continuity, they reveal a pattern. Each requires time, not an indefinite amount of time, but a sufficient amount. The 6 hours function as a container within which these actions can occur. If the process were shortened, the narrative would become incomplete. It would remain a story of suffering, but it would lack the layers that give that suffering meaning. This leads to a crucial realization. The duration is not accidental. It is calibrated. It allows for the completion of a sequence in which each component contributes to a larger whole. The suffering is real and unrelenting, but it is not purposeless. It unfolds in a way that ensures that certain things are said, certain connections are made, and certain meanings are established before the end arrives. This brings us directly to the climactic moment, the point at which everything converges. The final declaration, often translated as "it is finished," does not emerge as a cry of defeat. It is not the exhausted whisper of someone who can endure no longer. Instead, it carries the tone of completion. It signals that something has reached its intended conclusion. This is where the central paradox becomes most visible. From an external perspective, the scene appears to represent failure, a public execution, a condemned individual, the apparent triumph of opposition. These elements align with what would normally be interpreted as defeat. The narrative, however, reframes this interpretation from within. The declaration of completion transforms the meaning of the moment. To understand this, it is important to distinguish between ending and fulfillment. An ending can occur without purpose. It simply marks the cessation of something. Fulfillment, on the other hand, implies that a process has achieved its intended goal. The difference lies not in the outward appearance, but in the underlying structure. When the final words are spoken, they do not merely indicate that life is ending, they indicate that a mission has been accomplished. This reframing alters the entire trajectory of interpretation. The suffering, the duration, the sequence of events, all of it is drawn together into a coherent whole. Nothing is left unresolved. The forgiveness at the beginning, the darkness in the middle, the expressions of abandonment, and the interactions along the way all converge at this point. The declaration functions as a closure that integrates every preceding element. What makes this particularly striking is that the moment of death is not presented as something that interrupts the process, but as something that completes it. In most human experiences, death is seen as an intrusion, an event that cuts a narrative short. Here, it is the opposite. Death becomes the final component that brings the narrative to its intended conclusion. This is the paradox at the center of the entire account. Death is not merely an end, it is the point of completion. The very event that appears to negate everything instead confirms it. What looks like collapse is revealed as culmination. What seems like loss becomes the mechanism through which fulfillment is achieved. This paradox does not eliminate the reality of suffering. The pain remains fully present, the physical and psychological dimensions unchanged, but it redefines the meaning of that suffering. It is no longer interpreted solely in terms of what is lost, but in terms of what is accomplished through it. When viewed in this light, the 6-hour duration takes on its final significance. It is the span within which a complete process unfolds, from initiation to fulfillment. It is neither too short to be incomplete nor unnecessarily long. It is precisely what is required for the sequence to reach its intended conclusion. And so, the question we began with, why not die sooner, finds its answer not in the limitations of the body, but in the requirements of the mission. The process continues not because it must, but because it serves a purpose. And when that purpose is fulfilled, the end comes, not as an interruption, but as a completion. When the full arc of these 6 hours is finally brought into view, historical, medical, psychological, and theological, one final layer remains. It is the layer that moves beyond explanation and into implication. Because if those 6 hours are not merely a record of what happened but a structured and meaningful passage, then they inevitably raise a question that extends beyond the past and into the present. The 6 hours begin to function not just as a historical duration, but as a symbol. They represent a compressed version of something much larger, the way time itself can carry meaning when it is filled with intention. In ordinary life, time often feels repetitive, fragmented, or even wasted. Hours pass without significance, moments blur together, and meaning is often postponed for some undefined future. But within this narrative, time behaves differently. Every segment of those 6 hours carries weight. Nothing is incidental, nothing is empty. This reframes how time can be understood. Instead of asking how much time we have, the more important question becomes, what is done within that time? 6 hours, in this case, contain forgiveness, crisis, abandonment, connection, and completion. It is not the length that gives the time its significance, but the density of meaning within it. This challenges a common assumption, that importance is tied to duration. Here, a relatively short period becomes immeasurably significant because of how it is lived. From this perspective, the 6 hours become a mirror. They reflect not only what happened in that moment, but what is possible in any moment. If time can carry such depth under conditions of extreme suffering, then ordinary time, our time, cannot be dismissed as trivial. Each moment holds potential, even if it is not immediately visible. This leads directly to a more personal and unavoidable question. How are you living your time? Not in a vague or abstract sense, but in the concrete reality of daily decisions. When faced with conflict, do you respond with reaction or with intention? When confronted with difficulty, do you endure passively or engage meaningfully? When opportunities for connection arise, are they recognized or overlooked? The power of this question lies in its simplicity. It does not require extraordinary circumstances. It does not depend on dramatic events. Instead, it focuses attention on the ordinary patterns that shape life over time. Because just as those 6 hours were defined by a sequence of responses, each one contributing to a larger outcome, so too are our lives shaped by repeated choices, often small and unnoticed in the moment. 3 particular applications emerge clearly from this reflection. The first is forgiveness. The narrative begins with forgiveness not as a conclusion, but as a starting point. This challenges the idea that forgiveness must wait until conditions are ideal. In practice, this means reconsidering how we respond to being wronged. Holding on to resentment may feel justified, even necessary, but it also prolongs internal conflict. Forgiveness, by contrast, interrupts that cycle. It does not erase what happened, but it changes how it continues to affect us. In this sense, forgiveness is not only an ethical act, it is a strategic one. It reclaims control over how pain shapes the future. The second is patience and endurance. The 6-hour progression is not instantaneous. It moves through stages, each one requiring continuation despite increasing difficulty. This reflects a fundamental aspect of human experience. Meaningful processes often take time, and they often involve discomfort. The tendency to seek immediate resolution can lead to premature conclusions, decisions made not because they are right, but because they are easier. Patience, in this context, is not passive waiting, it is active persistence. It is the willingness to remain engaged even when clarity is not immediate. The third is intentional choice. One of the most striking elements in the narrative is the sense of agency even within constraint. Circumstances are not chosen, but responses are. This distinction is critical. Much of life consists of situations that cannot be controlled, external pressures, unexpected events, limitations. But within those constraints, there remains a space for decision. That space may be small, but it is significant. It is where meaning is formed. Choosing how to act, how to speak, how to interpret what is happening, these decisions accumulate, shaping both immediate outcomes and long-term direction. Taken together, these applications suggest that the message of the 6 hours is not confined to a singular event. It extends into a framework for understanding life itself. Time is not neutral. It is shaped by what is placed within it. And meaning is not something that appears automatically. It is constructed through consistent, intentional engagement with each moment. This brings us to the final synthesis. When we say that the 6 hours are important, we are not referring to them as a unit of measurement. We are referring to them as a journey that moves from action to reflection, from external pressure to internal response, and from fragmentation to completion. It is structured, purposeful, and complete. To reduce it to 6 hours is to miss its essence, because what is being described is not simply a passage of time, but a progression of meaning. Each stage builds upon the previous one, leading toward a conclusion that integrates everything that came before it. The duration is finite, but the implications are not. And this is where the final message becomes clear. Every minute carries potential significance, not because every minute will contain something extraordinary, but because every minute participates in a larger pattern. The way one moment is lived influences the next. Over time, these moments accumulate, forming a trajectory that defines the overall direction of a life. In this sense, the 6 hours function as both a historical event and a conceptual model. They demonstrate that even within limitation of time, of circumstance, of physical endurance, there can be coherence, intention, and completion. They suggest that meaning is not dependent on ideal conditions, but on deliberate engagement with whatever conditions exist. If this perspective resonates with you, and you want to explore more insights that connect historical events, psychological depth, and deeper layers of meaning, consider subscribing and following the channel. There is a vast landscape of ideas that often remain beneath the surface of familiar stories, ideas that, once examined, can reshape how we understand not only the past, but our own lives in the present. In the end, the 6 hours are not simply something to be remembered. They are something to be considered, not just as a measure of time, but as a reminder. Time, when lived with intention, becomes more than duration. It becomes meaning.